Hi, and welcome to Alyssa Faden Cartography. Today we're talking about making grids in Adobe Photoshop. I consider this to be an easy difficulty lesson. Now, while this guide is using Photoshop in all of its steps um, to demonstrate making grids, this is equally relevant for any Photoshop alternatives where the application in question doesn't easily support the addition of a principal grid. Now, what do we mean by principal grid? We are, of course, referring to our beloved overlay, like so, for dungeons and the likes. This grid is meant to be part of the map. It's not a guide, it's not a ruler, and it's not something that we're using to measure. This is something that's going to be intrinsically part of the actual printed output. Now, you might make this a little softer in the background. You might apply some layer effects to it, such as a dissolve effect or something like that, but ultimately it is part of the map. Now, Photoshop actually has two tools that you might think would do the trick straight away. First and foremost, there are these built-in guides. So if we actually go to here in the view menu, new guide, the window will pop up that will give you horizontal guides and vertical guides, and you can actually say, okay, well, I want a guide 0.5 inches, and Photoshop will give you one. Look at that, this thing of beauty. And if we did that again, view, let's do a new guide, and we maybe now make a horizontal, and again we do 0.5 inches, and there's another one. And if we did this over and over and over and over, well, okay, it would give us a grid of sorts, right? But the problem is, these guides aren't part of the map. You can use them to then draw along them and create a grid, but what a pain that would be, right? So guides are good for, straight lines measuring and showing things are sort of lining up together, but they're not going to be good for creating a grid here, not without a lot of work. There's another thing that we can do. We can actually do a view show grid. Now, hold on a minute, that just sounds perfect. Look at this. I'm going to zoom in. We zoom all the way in, and it looks like a perfect grid right here. I'm actually going to turn off the grid that I've drawn here so you can actually get a good idea just about how this seems to be exactly what we need. There's my grid turned off. Here's the Photoshop grid. Well, wait a minute. They're like exactly the same, right? Well, here's the catch. While this grid can actually be customized in the preferences section of Photoshop, so you get exactly the increments you want and even the colors you want, this is, again, not part of the drawing itself. I can't apply layer effects to this. I can't actually get rid of pieces of it if I don't want it to appear in certain sections of the map. This is an overlay. This is just a separate thing altogether that Photoshop is putting in place for us. So again, this is not really useful for creating a grid such as this. So I'm actually going to turn this off. I'm going to get rid of this grid. I would use the Photoshop grid, for example, if I was actually interested in maybe using it as a guide to draw my own lines, if I had certain measurements that I needed to do, lining things up. It's great for that. Not great if we're doing something like a dungeon where we actually don't want grids over here, we do want grids over here. We need this to be our ink, right? So here's a little trick that we're going to use. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new image. And this is going to sound a little bit crazy, right? I'm going to do File, New. And specifically, I'm going to create something that is of a size of one of these grid sections. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I'm going to draw a map that is 8.5 by 11, and I want my grid to be every quarter inch, something like that. Well, in that case, I'm actually going to create a new image that is a quarter of an inch across. Nice and simple. I'm going to make sure your resolution of this, by the way, is the same as how you're actually drawing your map. Let's say I'm going to be doing this at 300 dpi, so my actual grid image is going to be 300 dpi. There we go. Now, pretty simple, right? You're probably scratching your head going, yeah, but where's the grid? Well, here's the next bit. What I'm going to do is, let's just unlock our background here. Let's add a new layer. And I'm going to ensure that we've got black selected, and I'm going to actually select the pencil, and I'm going to make sure that our pencil is fairly small. This, by the way, is going to be our grid thickness. I like my grids to be noticeable, but not too heavy. So I'm going to pick something like 10 pixels here. And all I'm going to do is I am going to draw the edge, and I'm going to do almost like an inverted L shape. Now you might be looking at this going, okay, but that doesn't make a grid. But now imagine if I could paste this over and over and over, here and here and here and here. What you get is the forming of a grid with all of these next to each other. Now if we turn off the background, I'm going to do a Control A for select all, and then we're going to do something called define pattern. So if I now go to edit, define pattern, this little overlay appears. Now why we're doing a pattern is you can fill with a pattern. In other words, I've just created half of a single grid square, and if I fill an entire page with this, this is going to create the overall grid. Now I like to try and name my patterns appropriately, so this is a grid, and it is like, you know, let's just say for the sake of argument, quarter inch, 300 dpi, because you may end up with a small library of these, so you're going to need to be able to easily identify them. Now, let's do a file, new, and this time let's do our 8.5 by 11 that we spoke about. There we go. And this time, I'm going to do a fill. I'm not going to pick a foreground, I'm going to pick a pattern, and from a pattern overlay, I'm going to select our new fill that we created. Now, if I do this, there it is. This is a quarter inch grid. And you can obviously create new patterns like that for any size. Half inch, 0.2 inches. If you're not working in inches, do it centimeters or pixels. Pixels might even be even better. And this now is part of our map. So, for example, if I wanted to start erasing things, like in areas that aren't going to show maybe on part of the map, I can. It's ink, so to speak, at this point. I like to then actually just create a little bit of opacity on this, perhaps, or you know, I should say, throttle it back a little bit, create our paper behind the scenes. This one will actually fill with the regular foreground color. Now I've got my grid, it's not sort of taking up sort of too much room, and you can then obviously change the color on this. You could, and that's how I did it on the other map that I showed you a little bit earlier. I actually had it slanted towards the blue, and also apply effects. So one effect I actually do like to apply to my grids is actually a dissolve effect. And that works really, really nicely. Now, obviously, this is a little thick, this particular line, but this particularly, I mean, imagine drawing on top of this with a nice black rule here. We'll take our brush, we'll make our brush be something like, 15 pixels or so. And if I was going to draw my room here now, maybe here's my room, and we'll do something like, a 15 foot by 15 foot room. If each of these is just 5 foot. And, we'll draw in our door at the top here. Do our little corridor coming up. These are very, very then easy to follow. And then, likewise, if, let's say, we had another room over here, and this is all space that I didn't want, I can get rid of the grid here where I don't feel like it's necessary. Don't need to follow the walls. Don't need it in between the rooms. We can get rid of all of that. And that is quite simply how you can create a grid in Photoshop. So I hope that's actually been useful to you. I would love to see your maps that you create with this technique. Let me know if there's any useful sizes that you actually end up coming up with, or any useful effects that you do, or even the colors that you decide to change your grid to. Until then, I'm going to see you in the next guide.